I do want to reject the idea that the mind or the brain is literally doing computation. Because I don't think living beings are machines. I don't think that they process information. The metaphysical picture that we get from phenomenology is one where the universe is already animated by consciousness. It's not some foreign imposition onto a universe that is fundamentally lacking in consciousness. We start from something that is neutral, that is neither what's describable mathematical nor what is subjective. It's something that comes before that subject-object divide. We think, no, the cognitivists just got things wrong across the board. We should rather move to a cognitive science that uses the dynamical systems ideas, the inaction ideas, ecological psychology, concept of affordances, and think that those concepts are actually much richer. They can take us much further, actually, in understanding how the mind works.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anagalia podcast. Today, I have the guest Julian Kiverstein, and he's a great scholar that I was really excited to have a chat with. And I've been looking a little bit into his work. It has a lot of fascinating things to say about cognition, about what it means to be an agent in the world, and also I really like that. He's kind of in a lot of has a foot in many different places at the same time. So it's very interdisciplinary in nature as well, which I really respect, and I think it's always really interesting. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. And yeah, Julian, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, maybe just give like a 1 to 2 minute introduction, just for people that maybe not familiar with you. So just quick little bio and what you do.
Yeah, so my background is in philosophy, but I always work in between disciplines. So I originally got interested in philosophy in the 1990s when embodied cognitive science was first beginning to emerge. And so the idea of embodiment has always fascinated me. But at the same time, there was a lot of work on neural networks as an alternative to the kind of language of thought, which was very popular at that time in philosophy and in cognitive science. So there was the emergence of what we can think of as a kind of post-cognitivist strand in cognitive science. So that led me to start working in between philosophy and cognitive science. I came across this wonderful book by Evan Thompson, Eleanor Roche, and Francisco Varela called The Embodied Mind as an undergraduate. And that introduced me to this idea of inaction, which I've been working on ever since, but also this idea that you can do work at the intersection of continental philosophy, so drawing on phenomenological thinkers like Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and you can try to bring those sorts of ideas from phenomenology into conversation with cognitive science. So that idea of like trying to find room for subjectivity in human experience within cognitive science has always been fascinating and something that's inspired me. And so I did my PhD on that eventually at the University of Edinburgh. And while I was up there, I met Michael Wheeler, who works on Heidegger and cognitive science, and Andy Clark joined the faculty. And the idea of the extended mind was something that Andy was working on at that time with Dave Chalmers. They published a paper called The Extended Mind. And yeah, ideas about the extended mind occupied me for a while. So there's a kind of link there to post-phenomenology and thinking about human technology relationships. Andy later on started to work on predictive processing after my PhD, when we were working on a project on consciousness, and he found these ideas about the Bayesian brain and predictive processing that kind of grew out of his earlier work on connectionism and neural networks, artificial intelligence. And so that I also found very inspiring. I saw some links between phenomenological ideas like the idea of optimal grip in Merleau-Ponty, which maybe we can come back to, and ideas about free energy in predictive processing. So that's something that has now been a topic in my research for the past 10 years. And it led me into thinking about computational psychiatry, which is a field that's concerned with trying to model um, dysfunctions that leads to mental disorders. So as to provide a kind of link between the disturbances of experience that happen in mental disorders, things like psychosis, depression, anxiety disorders, OCD, and underlying neurobiological processes. Fortuitously, I ended up working in a psychiatry department. It's a colleague of mine, Eric Rietveld, who I've worked on philosophical research about the embodied mind for a long time. Ended up having projects that were based in the hospital here in Amsterdam. And that led me to collaborate with psychiatrists there to start to explore this link between mental health and uh, phenomenological changes and neurobiological processes. And currently, I'm now based in a research center which is concerned with the mental health crisis and trying to understand that using ideas from philosophy, but also from psychiatry and psychotherapy. And yeah, I think we're not only interested in when things go wrong in the mind and leading to mental disorders, but also what it is for people to be happy and to be well and to flourish. And can we start to actually address those questions as well about living a good life using ideas from cognitive science, from these predictive processing theory, from inactive theories, from ecological psychology, which has also been a big inspiration for me. So like bringing these different fields together, like you said at the beginning, the interdisciplinary approach, to try to address these big central questions in philosophy. That's been what I've been up to for the last 20 years or so.
Amazing, fantastic, and yeah, like what you just described is to me, it's just crazy how interesting it is because like everything that you said to me is, I think, just literally the most interesting things you can possibly learn about. And to me also, when I first started getting into all of this, like when I was younger, like I just had all these all these interests that I was trying to pursue and learn more about. Because like, oh, philosophy is really cool. There's a lot of things here that have a lot of value. But then there's also the psychology thing, which was kind of like partially my background as well. My undergrad was both philosophy and psychology, and then there was also religion and whatnot. And then the type of work that you're doing is just kind of like everything just like synthesized together to some degree. And yeah, it's just the best thing ever. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to. And also, I find it really funny as well, kind of your description of Varela's book as well, because especially with people that have been in this kind of in this field for a long time, or they're kind of like a little bit older academics, people not just like fresh out of university. That's a lot of their biographical retelling of their interest as well, which is like, oh, I came across this Varela book, and then it's like everything just kind of popped out for me. And I'm a little bit curious of like when you did like read Varela's book, and then once you started kind of like that whole transition, I suppose, a little bit, if I understood correctly, that kind of like influenced then kind of like your interest in cognitive science, like bridging from your original philosophical background. Like what specifically about that approach made you think this is something that I need to investigate, and there's something here that philosophy really needs?
Yeah, I think it was I was a bit of a radical, and what was being proposed here was a way to shake up the cognitive science community to present a new approach. And it was one that pointed to the importance of subjectivity, human experience, lived experience, and I was fascinated in consciousness and exploring consciousness in different ways, meditation, psychedelics, and within cognitive science, we don't really have the right set of theoretical and conceptual tools for making sense of human experience. So long as we just remain within this kind of computational representational paradigm. So I was excited by the radicalism of like trying to present an alternative framework for that would provide new conceptual foundations for cognitive science. And I was really persuaded by their argument that that was necessary because as long as we operated with this kind of mechanistic, machine-like understanding of living beings, we think of the brain as basically doing computation, information processing, then it would be very hard to see how you could fit experience into that and how you would be able to explain experience in those terms. I found that gap there. Now, already I was thinking about that by working on the hard problem and the explanatory gap. And the diagnosis of where the gap comes from inactive theorists, I found very persuasive. And then their remedy for that is also persuasive to me, that what we should do is to try to pay attention to approaches like contemplative practices and meditation, or to the phenomenological tradition, where there's been an enormous effort devoted to studying and describing lived experience, first-person experience, from a first-person point of view. And we could try to bring those traditions into conversation with cognitive science, and that, yeah, that was like, wow, can you do that? And how would you do that? Um, and yeah, once I started on that path, and I found that there are actually ways in which there are tensions involved in this project in the phenomenological tradition. There's a kind of anti-scientism, which is sometimes presented as an anti-naturalism, whereas approaches to the mind that start from cognitive science and neuroscience, they have this broader philosophical perspective, which is a naturalistic one, the idea that human beings in the end are evolved from other animals, and we should be able to explain the workings of the mind using the best science available to us. Whereas phenomenology was presenting a different perspective that was often given as a kind of anti-naturalistic perspective, where we would need to really start from thinking of consciousness as fundamental in some sense, as everything in the world disclosed to us from within consciousness, making consciousness something that's always presupposed when we start to do science, or it's always the starting point for us. So how then science would be able to get a grip on that and explain it, that gave rise to a puzzle for me. And that's been something that, one of the things that I've been occupied with ever since, and wrote about in my PhD. And yeah, I think I'm getting closer to being able to see how to solve the puzzle. Yeah, that was what the embodied mind opened up for me. And you can see that there's a whole universe to explore there, really. So yeah, that's what made the book so exciting for me.
Yeah, fascinating. And I didn't know actually that you had such an explicit interest in consciousness in this like most bare bones sense of like the hard problem and things like that. And I'll be curious to explore that a little bit, because actually to me there's kind of like two different takes here, and I'm not exactly sure how you putting this together, or how do you relate to them. Because for example, when I was younger, when I first started studying philosophy, I was also very obsessed with philosophy of mind and the hard problem of consciousness, and to some degree there was a period that's all I thought about. And then eventually I kind of gave up because it was the hard problem was too hard for me, so I just kind of left it aside. But then at some point I also got, just like you, very interested in phenomenology, and again, precisely because of all this ability to somewhat counteract this kind of like mechanistic representational kind of worldview that the culture and science more broadly was inheriting. And I saw, okay, like phenomenology is important because, again, it's like you said, consciousness is fundamental in the sense of this is where you start. Like this is your entire world. And so I also, obviously I'm very aligned with everything you said. Now the issue here is that you seem to, if I understood you correctly, that you were interpreting or somewhat making a claim that these two things kind of join together to some degree. And to me, um, when I've seen other people kind of within roughly the same boats, to me that's always a little bit confusing. It doesn't quite match in my head, because to me, kind of like this whole phenomenological approach is more or less kind of like an issue of worldview, and it's kind of like an existential orientation as well, which is like everything is experienced first, and that's kind of like that's how you need to conceptualize reality. And any reality that you're thinking of where you're just completely detached, you run into all kinds of problems, and it's in those kinds of problems is also to a large degree what phenomenology was responding to, and then also how that then influenced the whole late Coxai movement. But despite that, I don't actually see how, despite all the great progress that cognitive science has made, um, inspired by phenomenology, in better elucidating aspects of the mind, I can't help but think that makes no impact whatsoever, at least as far as I can see, in the actual hard problem of consciousness. So I'm curious to see like how these two perspectives, like how do you think they relate to each other?
Yeah, well, I think phenomenology gives you a way of thinking about consciousness where the hard problem doesn't really arise in the way that it's normally formulated. So if you take the classic kind of arguments for the hard problem, like David Chalmers' philosophical zombie, the idea there is that you could have an embodied being that behaves just like we do, and says all of the same things as we do, but it's entirely lacking in any subjectivity or any. There's nothing it's like to be that that being. And the idea that you can separate out embodiment from consciousness in that way, so you could have an embodied living being that was entirely lacking in subjectivity and consciousness, is something that I think we could challenge and question as an assumption from the using the tools of phenomenology, which show us that actually, being embodied and feeling and having a point of view on the world, moving around in that world so that what you're sensing is changing with your movements. The idea that you could have a being that was just like us in terms of its behavior, in terms of how it moves through its environment, in terms of what attracts it and what repels it. But there's nothing that it's like to be that creature. That's something that I think we can say doesn't really make any sense using phenomenological ideas. So one thing that I think phenomenology does is help us to redefine exactly what the problem is, where instead of trying to start from a physical universe and then get consciousness out of that, we kind of reverse the situation and start from consciousness and then see how to get the physical universe out of consciousness. Um, and yeah, I think once we have that shifting of the problem, that inversion of the problem, then the conceptual tools that we get actually from inactive theories, from ecological psychology, from all of these post-cognitivist developments that have taken place, help us to see how human experience could have evolved from more basic forms of sentience. So how there can be a gradual transition in living beings until you get the emergence of consciousness. But the crucial thing there is not to start from physics and then try to get consciousness out of physics, but to instead start from what is described in phenomenology, which is our embodied experiences of the world, our being in the world, and then take that to be a description of what needs to be explained. And then that becomes a constraint, as Francisco Varela put it, on the adequacy of the kind of science that you're constructing of consciousness, that it has to do justice to the phenomena as described in phenomenology, because that is what is defining the explanandum, the thing that we need to explain. So I think what's happened in post-cognitivist psychology is that we've started to get conceptual tools that could help us to start to see how to bring science into conversation with lived experience. And that was the original ambition of the embodied mind. And 1991, that book was published. I think Evan Thompson started working on it with Francisco Varela at the end of the 80s. And so there's been quite some time, but people have been developing that research program. And I think now what we're beginning to see are the fruits of that, where we can use these new ideas in cognitive science to actually have a cognitive science that accommodates human lived experience.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's still some areas there that I think are a bit fuzzy for me, but I don't want to derail the whole conversation into consciousness. Otherwise, people.
Well, let's try to delve into some of the fuzziness a little bit. I think it's useful, and this is like something that I really care about, so I'm happy to talk about it if you want to.
Okay, then maybe maybe just help me understand a little bit of how you conceptualize this part of the problem where it's kind of like lived experience first, and then you get the kind of and then you have the explanation of the actual physical reality, let's say, after that. So I get that, but then the issue is when you're speaking like evolutionarily, where it's kind of like, okay, at some point consciousness emerged, but also but I kind of forgot the exact phrasing you used, but at some point you were also talking about kind of like a progression, like a gradual evolving. So first of all, maybe let's start there. So it's like, how do you conceptualize consciousness? Is it like something that eventually it emerged because, I don't know, the nervous system got complex enough with ABC, or do you think it was there all along? But then if you think it was there all along, like what exactly does that mean? Like, do you put it at life? Do you then have to accept some kind of like some kind of like panpsychist or idealist notion, or kind of like where exactly do you conceptualize the boundary if you're trying to have this consciousness first, but at the same time, you need to take into account the actual problem of how do we make sense of mind and matter? Because I understand the issue with Charles' example, but also the argument is I think very very nuanced, and also it's just a thought experiment. But the problem was there, way earlier, right? So it's just like even if you don't accept kind of like his formulation of the thought experiment, and you kind of can make a kind of a embodied and activist argument against it. At the end of the day, we can still ignore all of that, step back, and again say we're conscious now. That's for sure. And the rock isn't conscious. So how exactly did that happen?
Very good. So that's a clear setup of the problem. There has to have been a transition at some point, so that from material reality, there was the first glimmers of subjectivity, um, and that's the hard problem. How could that have happened? I don't want to get into Chalmers too much, because that's I think that's not in the end a very productive way to pursue the problem. But instead, think about the metaphysical positions that you can have here. So there's a physicalist position that basically says the universe is what is going to be described in our best theories in physics, and then we need to find room in that understanding of the universe, that physical understanding, for consciousness and subjectivity. Then there's the panpsychist position that says that we need to introduce a new ingredient into physical reality, which is consciousness. So consciousness becomes one of the fundamental elements in reality somehow. And there are all kinds of puzzles that we can then raise about your rocks, for instance, and if they are physical, material entities that contain a little bit of consciousness, then there's a sense in which they're not dead, inanimate matter. They're they feel in a very minimal sense. And then there's a biopsychist position, which following on from the inactive idea that life and mind are continuous, would argue that that consciousness began with the primitive life forms in the primordial soup. So already with the most basic living beings, there was a kind of minimal sentience that was introduced. And Evan Thompson, in writing about this biopsychist position in relation to inaction, argues that although it may make sense to think of the most primitive life forms as not primitive in the sense of simple, but primitive in the sense of the original life forms that first emerged out of the primordial soup, they were capable of doing sense making, so relating to an environment of things that are attractive or that are repulsive because they threaten the existence of the life form in some way. But sense making isn't enough yet for subjectivity or sentience. So Evan Thompson argues that sentience probably emerged with the first nervous systems. And interestingly, those first nervous systems are ones that arose in creatures that were multicellular life forms, first of all, where there was a problem that they faced of how to coordinate the different cells to control movement in relation to the environment. So as soon as you had beings that were able to act and sense, there was a kind of unity, a kind of point of view that formed where the sensing and the moving were all kind of converging on a single body, with the beginning of that kind of coordination of sensing and moving, with the solving of that sensory motor coordination problem. I think you can make an argument that there was the beginning of a unified point of view. There was a sense of presence, a sense of being present in the world that started to emerge. And that's the beginning, I think, of subjectivity and sentience. And what I like about that story is that it converges very much with how we would think about consciousness from a phenomenological perspective, where we start from pre-reflective forms of experience that are embodied and are to do with kinesthesis, and so they're to do with movement and the way that movement is always accompanied by sensing and feeling. So you don't just sense and move through the world, you actually feel your way through the world. I think it makes good sense to say that, that once you have a nervous system that's able to solve sensory motor coordination, you also have a being with a point of view. Already we had that with sense making, but you also have a being that has a kind of feeling, that's able to evaluate things, that has some kind of affective point of view on the world, where there's valence, there's arousal. And these are the basic elements, I think, that you need for a kind of basal form of consciousness. So that's a kind of transition story. That was the thing that I said earlier, that there was a transition that happened over the course of evolution, where basic forms of consciousness became more complexified until you get to us with our cultural, technological worlds.
Yeah, great. That was a great explainer of that sort of thesis. And again, I didn't want to drag this too much, but since you're happy to talk about it because you like it and I also like it, we might as well just explore it a little bit further. So just one last point that I would like to bring up in relationship to that is that that story to me doesn't feel quite satisfying, and the reason is because you're making this argument where okay, so when the primordial life in kind of this primordial soup where the life first began, we don't need to attribute consciousness to that. And I'm like, I'm not exactly sure how one would make that judgment, but it seems reasonable at least. So like we can grant that. But then it's like okay, but they didn't. There wasn't like this complexification of what animals need to do, and there wasn't this like integration need that you mentioned with multicellular organisms and whatnot. Okay, but they were still alive. They were still embodied, and they still had to solve like problems, right? They had sense making, as you said. So if you're saying that they still didn't have consciousness, that what you eventually end up arguing is that sense making can occur like with the lights out, so to speak. And this is why I think the way that Chalmers puts his argument, that's why I think it's useful. So like in that specific animal, nothing is happening, right, as far as consciousness is concerned. But then you claim, okay, but then we get more complex um, organizations of life, and then we get nervous systems, and then like everything has to converge on a single point of view. Okay, but like, why does that require subjectivity? Because the issue is, if before that point, right? So it's like at some point there was, some creature that made this jump, right? There had to be a single point in the entire universe where that subjectivity occurred, like this big flash of light, right? Like this big mystery. But like before, that creature was a philosophical zombie, and he was still doing problems in the world. But then he wasn't. That required that subjectivity. But like, I don't understand how that jump is made, and especially because obviously this also opens a whole can of worms in terms of AI and computation and whatnot. But certainly you can go pretty far. You can go pretty far in terms of problem solving, just in terms of algorithms. Let's say in terms of like logic, right? If this then that, you can get that pretty damn complex, right? And then you could argue that through an evolutionary lens, eventually those algorithms then converge into something that ends up being something like life, right? That's kind of the argument and the worldview for people that conceptualize nature as a machine, right? It's kind of like this dead stuff that doesn't actually feel anything. Like consciousness, we don't need to account for consciousness, are just these robots, right? So my struggle is, okay, we have these robots that can certainly do sense making, and then you have these non-robots a second later that somehow now require this completely new thing out of the universe that has never existed before. I don't understand how that gap is like how that occurs. Like, why are you justified in doing that? It feels more like this. It feels like an argument for emergence. It's kind of like, okay, this emergent property occurs, but I still don't understand how that explains anything exactly.
I think that you overstate the gap when you say that then it's like Chalmers sets things up where the lights are out and then they suddenly come on. Whereas I would say the gap is between sense making and sentience, and that's a much smaller gap than lights off, lights on gap. um, so why is it a smaller gap? Well, because already with sense making, with the bacterium that the E. coli that is able to climb a sugar gradient, a sucrose gradient, and move away from acids, there's already a kind of valence in play there, a sensitivity to what is threatening and what is beneficial because it's a source of nutrition. So instead of starting from dead inanimate matter and then asking how on earth do we get any consciousness out of that, we start from living beings that have a concern for their own continued existence because they are precarious. They have a kind of precarious existence, and they have certain needs that drive them. And so we're starting from an understanding of life not as a machine where the machine has to be designed by natural selection, but instead we're starting from a organism that it has concern for its own ongoing continuation. One might say that as soon as you've got organisms, even little single-celled organisms or plants, then you've got sentience because you've got a concern for the continued existence of that organism. when a plant moves its roots away from something that is potentially dangerous in the soil, that it's sensing, you might think that there's a concerned point of view. There's not only an aliveness to its behavior, but there's a caring about the continuation of the existence of that organism, even in plants. And so an argument could be made then that there's a kind of, not just an aliveness, but a kind of sentience, a kind of subjectivity that's already in play in any organism. Now, that's the biopsychist position that I mentioned earlier on. So in the history of biology, going back to discussions of vitalism in the 19th century, there are always biologists who favored a view of life where mind was already present, and not just mind in the sense of sense making and in action, but bringing forth a meaningful world kind of notion of mind, but this subjectivity idea, this consciousness idea. So biology, life, and consciousness were intertwined right from the start for those biologists. And that's the position that Evan Thompson has critiqued recently and argued that he doesn't think that sense making on its own, and I think he's right about this, is sufficient for subjectivity. So you can have differential behavior and so on, and that's what you were pointing to with the zombie again, saying that reintroduces the possibility of a zombie. But I don't think it quite does reintroduce the possibility of a zombie, because the zombie is, of course, this like machine that it doesn't have cares and concerns and values of its own, that it's the source of. It just is something that looks like it does and behaves in the way that we do, and then we project those cares, concerns, and values onto its behavior. But that's the wrong starting point from an inactive standpoint, because even simplest life forms do have a care and concern for their own continuation. Hans Jonas talks about this in terms of need for freedom, and that's what separates out living beings from machines that use feedback, like cybernetics was describing at that time. And Jonas was arguing, as a phenomenologist, that there's a difference between life and what's described in cybernetics when we look at systems that control their behavior using feedback. And the difference is that with a living system, that system is motivated by this need for freedom, this concern to find the resources that are needed for the continuation of its existence. And you see that in any system that has a metabolism. So metabolism for Hans Jonas was the beginning of care and concern and having a point of view. Now, Evan Thompson says, well, he agrees with that, with Jonas about that, but he thinks that isn't yet enough for subjectivity. So there is a kind of gap, but it's a gap between sense-making and subjectivity, and that's a different kind of gap to the one that is described in the hard problem. And I think it's that gap that then we can start to address by thinking about, well, maybe subjectivity is something that you get with a nervous system. So where did nervous systems come from? Well, they probably started in creatures like jellyfish that have this net of nerves that are distributed across their body. And then they have to solve this problem of how to coordinate the activity in the different cells so as to move through the watery environment in which they exist. So as soon as you had a creature that can solve that problem of sensing and moving and how to coordinate sensing and moving, then you have a kind of unified point of view, because the sensing and moving is being brought together in a way that forms what Susan Hurley called a dynamic singularity. So the flow of causes are all anchored in a particular body that gives you a kind of singular point of view. And that is that's the beginning of both a nervous system and a subjective point of view. I would suggest, following people like Susan Hurley, but also more recently Peter Godfrey Smith in the work that he's done on the evolution of consciousness.
Right. Now, the issue that I still struggle within that framework is when you say, okay, it's not an actual, like, you can tell me, like, the gap that I'm describing is this gigantic gap that fundamentally misunderstands kind of the evolution of consciousness, and then you can say, okay, then consciousness, actually we attribute that to this, like, the emergence of nervous systems, kind of multicellular organisms that need to converge on a single decision from a lot of stuff happening. Okay, that's fine, but then what was there before was just sense making. But to me, that's kind of a weird, like, a weird position to take, because to me that kind of, and again, this might be because of lack of agreed definitions. I've run into this rabbit hole a few times in my podcast when discussing philosophy of mind. But to me, the issue is, if you say it's not a gap because there was sense making before, then to me that has to mean that there was some sense of what is it like to be that organism, like whatever variance it had, whatever um, whatever system it had, where it had an experience in order to achieve any certain goal whatsoever, as long as it has care, as you mentioned. To me, that is consciousness. So like, if we do that, then you can say, okay, now we move consciousness back. Now you can say, um, you can say that you can't do that because consciousness starts here, right? It starts with this point, which is what I was actually trying to retell, or at least to briefly summarize a little bit of that kind of argument. And that's why I mentioned this nature has a machine. It's not that I agree with that, quite the opposite. But the reason why I framed it that way is because to me that's an unavoidable consequence of putting consciousness over here, right? So if I say consciousness starts here and then before it was sense making, I feel like, okay, either you just put consciousness backwards, or you make this division of, like, that matter and then consciousness emerges. And the reason why I think that matter is useful is because, again, you can make that argument that things can behave in a certain way, that they have goals, even if there is no experience whatsoever. Again, precisely because we can computationally model that, right, to some degree, like a very basic one. And so help me sort out this dilemma. Like, where am I getting wrong? Where this dichotomy that I'm perceiving in that kind of thesis, why is that wrong?
One thing I want to do is go back to the problem and how it's normally set up. So since the scientific enlightenment, we've had this understanding of the universe where we can divide things up into what's subjective and what can be objectively described using the scientific method. So what can be mathematically modeled, basically, because mathematics is the language in which nature is written. And so that's the kind of scientific enlightenment model of the universe, that the universe is fundamentally what can be described mathematically. But let's go back to first principles and think, well, is that correct? So from a phenomenological standpoint, science is an activity of human beings that's done in what's called the life world, the Lebenswelt. And so there's the laboratory of the scientists, there's the experimental techniques that science has developed, and there are scientific theories that are used to set up those experiments, to interpret their results and findings. So all of that is a human activity done by scientists who are conscious. So when we try to use scientific theories to explain consciousness, and we start to think about how could it be that starting from dead inanimate matter, we get to consciousness and there being creatures that it's something it's like to be, that have concern for their continued existence. We're starting from an assumption that what's basic and fundamental is nature as it's described mathematically using our best scientific theories. Whereas phenomenology would invite us to instead start from lived experience. That's where we start from. That's what we have to return to. And so then the question, well, how do we generate consciousness out of life, or how do we generate life out of inert matter? And those are scientific questions that are asked by conscious beings. And so consciousness is what's fundamental here. And if we think of nature, consciousness as existing in nature, then it has to be that the notion of nature that we start from is not a disenchanted understanding of nature where there's no room for consciousness in it. Rather, the metaphysical picture that we get from phenomenology is one where the universe is already animated by consciousness. It's not some foreign imposition onto a universe that is fundamentally lacking in consciousness. I think a lot of the way that the hard problem is set up is just wrong in terms of the philosophical assumptions that it's premised on. Now, in my work, I rather start from phenomenology and what's described there, and then try to see how could you get that in a scientific worldview? How could you get that in nature as it's described scientifically and objectively using the methods of the natural sciences? And once we start to do that, then I think that we can start to make progress using ideas like sensory motor identity, sense making, biological autonomy, because these are notions that help us to get a grip on life and nature, where we might start to see how nature could already include consciousness rather than it being something that is separate from nature and we have to try to rediscover somehow. So that's a kind of big picture attempt at reframing your problem that you set up for us. I think that the problem is premised on some mistaken assumptions that I want to challenge.
I see. Yeah, that's very helpful. And I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of develop this further. And I think it's quite helpful for people watching as well that are interested in this problem of consciousness. Um, I still have some issues with it, but we need to move on. And also, it's quite possible that my issues is because um, I'm just too stupid to be able to reframe kind of my whole way of how I'm seeing the problem.
Let me give you another metaphysical perspective that I think has been very influential on me. So when I started from phenomenology, I was always inspired by passages where phenomenologists would describe how self and world kind of arise together. And so instead of working in the kind of subject-object dichotomy, which is what we're used to operating in when we think about representations. So there's a representation inside of the head, and then there's the world that's represented. And the problem in philosophy is how to bring these two things together. That's where we get all kinds of epistemological problems started. But in phenomenology, you don't really start from that picture where there's subjects and objects, and then we have to somehow reconnect them. You start instead from an idea which is more relational, that the reality that we inhabit, and we need to start from thinking about the self and the world as a single unity. Um, and you see something similar in what William James called radical empiricism, where he had this idea of pure experience, which is what he thinks is most fundamental. And pure experience is not immaterial. It has materiality to it. But it is prior to that separation of subject and object. So there's a kind of relation that we can describe in a mind-world relation that's described in phenomenology, but also in the pragmatist tradition, where there's something that comes before the separation of the knower and the known, or the subject and the object. And instead we think in terms of these subjectivity and objectivity as co-emergent, as arising together. And you see that in the inactive literature. You also see it in phenomenology. And I think it gives us a different metaphysical picture, where when we start to think about, well, what is matter? What is physical exactly? What is the nature of physical reality? instead of thinking, well, it must be objective and quantifiable and mathematizable, we start from something that is neutral, that is neither what's describable mathematical nor what is subjective. It's something that comes before that subject-object divide. So that's a kind of metaphysical picture that I think emerges quite naturally out of phenomenology, a neutral monist picture, but also out of this post-cognitivist 4E approaches to cognitive science. That's different from physicalism, which generates the hard problem. If you start from something that's more neutral in terms of is it physical, is it mental? It's a bit of a mixture of both. Then, yeah, I think the problem is actually redefined, and it doesn't look quite as tricky as it did as long as you operate from within physicalism.
Right. I actually think that's quite helpful. So I think that more metaphysical move, I still struggle a little bit with it, but to me that makes a lot of sense. To me that seems a reasonable, plausible kind of thesis to defend, precisely of this metaphysical view that there's this neutral, monism that is kind of primordial to everything else. To me that clicks a lot more in my head. But then there's some other issues that eventually I have to figure out and better explore. But also this whole issue of kind of the subject object distinction. Yeah, that's something that I struggle a lot, and I've been thinking a lot, but also that I haven't read a lot on. Like, there's a lot of literature on it, especially recent literature, like the last, I don't know, 50 years or something. No, more. Yeah, more. Almost 100 years, I suppose, that I still need to read. So it's still a bit fuzzy in my mind, and maybe once I read some of those arguments, that maybe that will click a little bit better. But my reading list is endless, so who knows when that will happen.
Well, I think the way to understand it is to start from intentionality as it's defined in phenomenology. So intentionality, there's two poles to an intentional structure of consciousness, the subject pole and the object pole. And because you're starting from intentionality, you're always working with both poles. So you're never working with just one or the other, and they're separated from each other and have to be brought back together. You're always thinking about a structure of consciousness that is both has self on one side and world on the other. And so these two things always arise together. And similar ideas in Buddhism about codependent arising. And so there's a way in which the work on consciousness in the Western tradition of phenomenology is convergent with Eastern philosophy when it comes to thinking about the metaphysics of the mind-world relation.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned intentionality, because that's precisely where I wanted to go as well, especially to actually start talking a little bit more directly about your work. So maybe let's unpack that a little bit. Just give like a little quick intro about kind of like intentionality itself as a concept, and kind of the whole tradition, Ponty, and maybe there's some other people behind it that mentioned explicitly as well. And then I'll after that basic framework, maybe it would be nice to uh, explore a little bit how you use that into your own work, and how you develop that notion of intentionality. I believe that you kind of use this notion of skilled intentionality, so maybe unpacking that, I think, would be quite interesting.
Yeah. So the notion of intentionality was first introduced at the beginnings of phenomenology by a teacher of Edmund Husserl, who is the founder of that tradition, who argued that intentionality was the mark of the mental. So you can use the notion of intentionality to distinguish the mental from anything else. So intentionality would actually mark out what is the subject matter of psychology. Um, and what is intentionality? Well, it's the directedness of the mind at the world. So when I have a thought about my cats, then my thought is about the cats, and it has the property of intentionality, which is what makes my thoughts about something, about that specific object, in the particular way that I'm thinking about them. And intentionality has often been understood in representationalist terms. So we think that what has intentionality must be states of mind which are like little representations, like pictures or sentences that are inside of the brain that have this intentional directedness. But in the traditions that I work in cognitive science, we try to operate with non-representational understandings of intentionality. So instead of thinking of intentionality as a physical property of brain states, then we somehow have to puzzle out how could some cells in the brain get to be about something in the world? How could they come to be meaningful and represent anything external to the body? We start by thinking of intentionality as something that is embodied. And so we see intentionality in sensory motor behavior when we are reaching for an object and our hands are forming a shape that fits the object that we're about to pick up. There's a kind of intentionality at work there, in that our hand movements are directed at the cup that we're reaching for, that we're about to grasp hold of. So that's what Merleau-Ponty called motor intentionality. In the Netherlands, where I live, everybody has a bicycle that they use to travel on. So riding a bike is a skill that everyone has, that they learn very early on in life. And then that skill is something that they carry with them. So there's a kind of operative intentionality, as Merleau-Ponty called it, to how people in the Netherlands that can ride bikes relate to their bicycle, where they know how to ride the bike. So that's a kind of embodied intentionality again, where there's an embodied know-how that the agent has developed that they then carry with them in their body. And so you can see how in that kind of embodied intentionality, there's a kind of memory that the body has of how to do something, what's called procedural memory in psychology. But it's a kind of memory, a skill through which we then perceive the world, so that when we encounter a bicycle, because of this skill of knowing how to ride the bike, we're immediately ready to jump on it and to find the right kind of balance with the bicycle and to move on it. So there's a way in which through our body we are related to, in this case, the bicycle as equipment that we can use to travel on. So our body is directed towards the world here. That's the intentional relationship, where because of the skills, the know-how we've developed, we're bodily ready to do certain things when we encounter bicycles, let's say, to continue with that example. But you can run the same example for all of the things that we encounter in the life worlds that are objects that have cultural, meaningful value for us. So what we encounter in the world, we encounter through the skills that we embody that make us ready to do multiple different things at the same time. So the most basic way we have of relating to the world is through that relation to the world is intentionality. The most basic forms of intentionality come from the kinds of skills that we embody, that we develop and cultivate. And what we try to do in our work, so this idea of operative motor intentionality was something that Hubert Dreyfus was very inspired by in making his critique of artificial intelligence. And that for me was another one of the things that I discovered as an undergraduate. I discovered Hubert Dreyfus's book, What Computers Cannot Do. I think that's what it's called. And then he wrote a follow-up, What Computers Still Cannot Do. The book was basically using his understanding of embodied skills that he got from phenomenology, from reading people like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Martin Heidegger, and then developing an understanding of skill as something that artificial intelligence or computers would never be able to embody, because they rely on these decontextualized representations for their knowledge, for the things they know. And for Dreyfus, that kind of propositional logic-like representation of knowledge was never going to be sufficient to reproduce what an embodied living creature learns to do by growing up in a culture, the kinds of sensitivities they come to embody. That could never be reduced to computation, to the sort of thing that can be described in terms of rules and representations. We got to the notion of skilled intentionality really from Dreyfus's work in critiquing artificial intelligence, what was called good old-fashioned artificial intelligence by John Hoagland. So this is a kind of approach to modeling the mind where you basically try to reconstruct in the form of a program everything that humans know, and then because the model is using like rules and logic to reason, it can use its programming to solve problems. And Dreyfus argued, and I think he was right about this and has not been proven wrong by all of the developments in AI, that the machine would never be able to exhibit motor operative intentionality because it doesn't have a body and it doesn't grow up in a culture in which it learns how to do things. And so in the end, the kind of representational proposition language like representations that it uses, that those forms of intentionality that are tied to propositions and to logic, would not be able to capture the embodied skills of human beings. So you would never be able to have a strong artificial intelligence, a model that was organized in such a way as to be able to solve all of the problems that humans can solve. Dreyfus put this in terms of background understanding, which he thought we embody. And it's that notion of the backgrounds that we tried to characterize using this notion of skilled intentionality. So what is the background exactly? Well, it's the abilities and skills we have to find our way around in complex real-world environments, where we're able to enter into these kind of smooth coping mode of engaging with the world. Dreyfus sometimes talks about that as a kind of flow experience where you are so absorbed in what you're doing and your attention is so taken up with the world that there isn't room for thinking and for things that occupy you in your minds to get in the way. You're just totally taken up with the world. And that, he thought, was the right way phenomenologically to understand the mind-world relation, that kind of mode of being absorbed in a flow-type experience. And thoughts and so on that we would characterize using representations and logic, they only arise when there's a kind of breakdown in that absorbed mode of coping with the world. Now, you can talk more about that. I don't think Dreyfus was entirely right in how he set things up there, but he was really the inspiration for us in thinking about skilled intentionality. And my colleague Eric Rietveld, during his PhD, went to study at UC Berkeley with Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Kelly, who was there as well, who's now a professor at Harvard, worked on phenomenological ideas with Hubert Dreyfus as well. Yeah, so Eric was lucky enough to be able to discuss some of these ideas with Hubert Dreyfus, and then we went on after that, after Eric finished his PhD, to start to develop these ideas about skilled intentionality and what we call the landscape of affordances, the field of relevant affordances. So these are all ideas that kind of grew out of trying to make sense of background understanding using the tools of ecological psychology and inactive cognitive science.
Yeah, amazing. That was really well put. And I messed up my question. I was when I initially was framing up intentionality, Ponty came to mind, but that's because I was thinking about motor intentionality. But obviously, intentionality itself has a much older kind of background and tradition. I'm really glad that you kind of set all of that up nicely, and you made those tiny little jumps very well explained as well.
Yeah, so Merleau-Ponty has always been like one of my heroes alongside Varela and the other people I mentioned. And yeah, so trying to, what he did in his phenomenology was already to open up this conversation with neurology, looking at patients with brain damage and describing the ways in which their perception of the world was changed by the damage that they had to their brain. But also, psychiatry he was in conversation with, and psychology, Gestalt psychology. So in a way, what he was already doing in his work, I think, is what you see in now 4E cognitive science. So you had Sean Gallagher as one of your guests earlier, and and he, has continued this kind of model of how to do phenomenology in conversation, in dialogue with cognitive science. And that was already started by Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah, and that kind of use of psychology and actually empirical evidence. That's something that I really admire about Ponty as well. And I remember back in my undergrad days when I was kind of having my philosophy modules, I would always try to sneak in some cognitive science or some psychology, and the professors would hate it. Like they would not like that at all. It's like this is philosophy. You can't just cite random stuff just because you like it and it's cool, even though it's relevant. I mean, I could have probably done better, but I was just getting started in studying. But still, but just out of principle, people really don't like it, and you probably had a similar experience. But it's not like this is new. And again, if Ponty did it, everyone can do it. Like you can't you can't argue with that. I would say. Um, Great, and also you then also mentioned this notion of affordances of backgrounds, kind of background knowledge. Let's say one way to put it. So I'd love to dig into that a little bit. But before we get into that as well, there's two issues that I wanted to explore a little bit deeper in relationship to Dreyfus. So number one, you mentioned that there's some stuff that you think Dreyfus didn't quite get right. So I'd love to expand on that because I've also been very influential by him. So I'd like to know exactly what your points of contention are. And also, Dreyfus, from my experience, has a little bit of a mixed reputation in philosophy. Like a lot of the times, he's critiqued by doing an interpretation of Heidegger that isn't quite faithful. Because, for example, you mentioned his two works on AI and kind of computation and all the arguments that he makes. And if you read his book on being in the world, which is about Heidegger, he actually repeats a lot of that same thesis. So like he sees that almost already in Heidegger itself. And a lot of people critique that. People just think that he's just kind of like doing his own Heidegger that is not actually faithful to the original and what Heidegger was trying to say. And from my experience, I honestly don't think that's true. Like I'm certainly no Heidegger expert or anything like that, but from where I read, I can't help but feel like Dreyfus is exactly on the money. So I'd love to hear your opinion about it, of how faithful Dreyfus was to Heidegger, and how much of a bridge you can make from Heidegger all the way to these kinds of coxswain arguments, and then your overall critique of Dreyfus as well, in whatever you think he got wrong.
Yeah, so I think it's fair enough to say that Dreyfus maybe misses certain elements of Heidegger. So the commentary that he wrote focuses on division one, and there's a little bit of treatment of division two of being in time. And he certainly has engaged with later Heidegger. But Heidegger's such a rich theorist, philosopher, that inevitably, when we deal with his work, we're going to be offering a partial reading and interpretation, which, to be fair, is what Heidegger himself did with other philosophers. He offered his own interpretation and reading of how they fitted into his history of being. And Dreyfus was concerned with certain problems coming out of his work in analytic philosophy and his training in analytic philosophy. And the valuable thing he did, as far as I'm concerned, is open up these conversations between analytic and continental philosophy that were previously taboo and were very difficult for philosophers to actually engage with anyone from the continental tradition if you're trained in an analytic department, as I was. So Dreyfus was a valuable thinker for opening up those conversations. And since then, I think there's been much more of a possibility to, within either of these traditions, engage with either as a continental philosopher with the analytic tradition or vice versa. And so I think we owe him a great debt for overcoming some of those ridiculous entrenched divisions that we have within the discipline of philosophy. Now, what goes wrong in his writings, I think, are he tries to always start from a experience that we can all understand, like, for instance, reaching for a door handle and going through a door, which we all do without giving it any thought or attention. We do it all the time. And Dreyfus would start from that kind of phenomena and then try to develop a whole kind of philosophy from that, from an everyday experience like that. Um, and and what happened, I think, in the case of his thinking about the mind-world relation is that he wanted to begin from a kind of experience where there is no divide between the subject and object. So when you reach for the door handle, there's not any kind of things going on in your mind that separate you from the door handle that then require that you to be reconnected with the world. There's just this flow of activity that you're caught up in. You're invited by the door handle to turn it and then pull the door open. And if you run into trouble and the door is locked, or it's a sticky door and the door handle is not working or something, then you might start to think about how to solve the problem. Maybe I'm not turning it right. Maybe it's a weird kind of door handle that works in a strange way from the doors that I'm used to opening. And so then you go into a kind of mode of consciousness where there is a kind of separation of subject from object. But ordinarily, when we're dealing with what Heidegger called the ready to hand, the door handle, there isn't this kind of mode of relating to the world where there's that separation. So what's happened in the literature since Dreyfus is people have started to argue that there isn't this kind of sharp divide between what is present at hand to us, like an object with properties, and what is ready to hand, like the affordances of the door handle. And they've started to try to explore a kind of middle ground, which Michael Wheeler calls the unready to hand. So that's one thing that's happened. Now, I don't want to agree with Michael Wheeler either about this. I think Dreyfus is probably closer to having things right with the door handle way of describing things. And I want to kind of push harder on that sort of example, actually, and say that we should not make this separation between the thinking and the intellect, where we start to think that's where representations come in, and then the cases of smooth coping, where there are no representations. But we should push harder and think about, well, can we use the same sort of understanding of the world that we have when we're practically engaged with it, like in the door handle kind of example, and try to understand what happens in the more intellectualized, propositional, language-like cases. That's quite similar, actually, as a continuation of the kind of understanding we have when we're practically engaged with the world. So we try to have this notion of skilled intentionality cover cognition across the board. So not just the motor behavior and think, well, it's just motor behavior that works in this kind of, we're drawn into action by solicitations. So it's not just like when we're playing tennis or when we're moving through the worlds that we enter into that kind of mind-world relation. But also, we are drawing on skills and know-how when we talk to one another, as we're currently doing. We get into a kind of flow experience there as well, in a good conversation, where we kind of riff off each other, and there's a kind of, there's very much the same phenomenology that Dreyfus was describing as happens in skilled coping can also happen in a conversation. So, coming from Wittgenstein and also influenced by Alva Noé's work, we tried to argue that what happens in Dreyfus is he kind of over-intellectualizes the intellect and thinks that there's a lot more, that the representationalists were actually right about how they understood the intellect, and we should just have a non-intellectualized understanding of perception and action. But there's this kind of divide between perception and action and then higher cognition, which is what the cognitivists got right. And we think, no, the cognitivists just got things wrong across the board. There isn't anything that they describe well. We should rather move to a cognitive science that that uses the dynamical systems ideas, the inaction ideas, ecological psychology concept of affordances, and think that those concepts are actually much richer than Dreyfus allowed them to be, and they can take us much further actually in understanding how the mind works.
Yeah, wonderful. That's really well explained, and this is actually a fantastic bridge. Since I wanted to talk about affordances later, this actually is super relevant to what you just described about Dreyfus as well. Because I was just reading your paper. What was the paper? Rich landscapes for affordances. I think I was reading that yesterday, and it was really good. I really enjoyed it, and I think it was brilliantly put. But one thing that was a little bit confusing to me is that, and again, you have to understand that this comes a little bit from a place of ignorance, because I'm not super well versed on this literature. I'm still feeling my way out. So like, for example, I haven't read, you know, Gibson's original work or whatever. I'm always reading other people citing him, right? So it's like my understanding is fairly superficial. But the understanding that I had was that this is how cog sci and the whole tradition of phenomenology was using affordances in the first place. So like it seemed that you were arguing that Gibson's affordances that were still stuck on this like motor application, very much in the same way that you are claiming now that Dreyfus has had this like very basic examples where you do have this elimination of kind of like this subject object distinction, and then there's kind of like this flow state, so to speak, where you just enact directly. And I think from what I remember, that does apply to Dreyfus, roughly from what I remember reading him, of this like division that you just spoke of. But I'm curious, number one, like how does this apply in the case of Gibson? Like, did he also think that there was kind of like these representations of like higher forms of thought in some way? And also just maybe help us understand a little bit of, like, in more recent times, let's say in the past 20 to 30 years, what has actually been the advancement of how we think about affordances that wasn't actually present in Gibson and also the whole tradition that he was inspired to beforehand?
Yeah, so Gibson's ecological psychology puts forward this idea that perception and action are working together, and that we are able to directly perceive possibilities for action that the environment offers to us. So the idea of direct perception there was put forward as an alternative to the cognitivist model, where perception is the outcome of unconscious inference of some sort. So there's always this ambiguous sensory information that needs to be disambiguated in terms of what it's about in the world. Whereas Gibson thought, no, there's information actually present in the environment. There's a kind of ecological information that comes from how forms of energetic stimulation are interacting with the substances and surfaces of the environment. And animals' perceptual systems, which are embodied and which they move around and use to move around, those perceptual systems are attuned to directly pick up information that specifies what Gibson called affordances, or possibilities for action. So affordances are something then that in Gibson's perceptual psychology, creatures are attuned to. They resonate with those affordances. That's how he describes it. So resonance is a way of thinking about how perceptual systems relate to the information in the environment that they can then pick up on to detect affordances. Gibson was writing about things that fit in many ways with phenomenology. He read Merleau-Ponty, and we know he wrote notes on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. But he was also very inspired by William James and John Dewey and the pragmatist tradition, where you find again ideas which are very similar to phenomenological ideas, as I mentioned earlier. So Gibson introduced this notion of affordance to do what I suggested earlier, of trying to find something that's neither subjective nor objective. He has this peculiar sentence where he says, affordances are neither subjective nor objective. They are both, if you like. And so how could something be both subjective and objective? Well, they can be both if they're relational, if they somehow come before that divide between subjectivity and objectivity. So you can see that there's a kind of metaphysical picture that is already covered by this notion of affordance as Gibson understood it. That underlying his theory of direct perception is a kind of metaphysical picture where we start from an organism in its environment, where there's a kind of mutuality or relation of complementarity between the organism and what it can do, and the environment and the affordances that the environment offers. So Gibson, again, like phenomenology, is starting from this relation, and that's something similar to the intentionality idea, which starts from the self-world relation. Gibson was starting from the organism-environment relation. And that's what he characterizes using the notion of affordance.
That was great. Now, just to cover a little point to help me understand a little bit better. So I've read this notion of both the objective and the subjective kind of being meshed together, and obviously we talked about this in the beginning as well when we were talking about consciousness. But to me, this is, and again, this is something that I'm still working through. But to me, this is particularly hard to understand within the context of Gibson, because on one hand, I totally understand the aspect of relationality. Like, to me, that makes perfect sense, right? Which is like there's the agent, and then it's an environment, and they're kind of like a handshake, that they're kind of like they're mutually constitutive of each other, and you can't separate the two. However, I see that more has like a contextualization of what you're describing, which is like there's these interactions here, and yes, they're relational, but the subjectivity of of this link between the objective and subject is simply because you're describing this individual that is embodied and situated and embedded in a particular environment, and therefore that's why the affordances are specific, and that's why they show up in this specific way. That's the subjectivity aspect of it. But that subjectivity in this like in this sense of like finitude, where you're kind of like applying it specifically to this thing right here, and that's what constitutes the relation. But I don't see how that necessarily brings metaphysics, which is often a little bit more what people usually mean by this like collapse of the subject and object, and certainly what we were talking about in the beginning when we were talking about consciousness. So help me unpack this a little bit of how this metaphysical perspective makes sense within the example that you gave of Gibson, and why my framing of the duality is wrong, and it's more than just contextualizing what you're describing.
So Gibson was writing at a time when I think the divide between psychology and philosophy was originally there wasn't that divide. And going back to William James, he was both a psychologist and a philosopher. And Gibson was taught by Holt, who was taught by William James. So there's a kind of a legacy that Gibson is part of, where that divide between philosophy and psychology was not as wasn't present. There wasn't the silos that there are today separating these disciplines. So was Gibson doing metaphysics when he was putting forward his theory of perception? Well, I think he was in many ways, because he was so inspired by pragmatist philosophical ideas in his in coming up with his psychology, and he was interested in foundational questions in psychology. So the kinds of concepts and theories that psychologists employ when they are doing experiments and trying to understand how perception works. He was providing a whole set of new conceptual foundations for doing a psychology of perception. That was his ambition. That's where ecological psychology comes from. It's premised on a whole set of concepts and theories that give you a different way of thinking about how perception could work. So because he's working with these fundamental conceptual questions, foundational questions, I think that makes his project one that overlaps strongly with what philosophers are up to. So at the same time as he was a brilliant psychologist that was able to design brilliant experiments, even more so his wife, Eleanor Gibson, she was a brilliant experimentalist as well, but they were both also brilliant theoreticians, and that's what makes them, I think, strongly overlap with what we're doing when we think about metaphysical questions in philosophy. Now, yes, he was concerned with context, and one of the things that marks out, I think, 4E cognitive science is that, like Alicia Guerrero says, context matters for everything. And that's a kind of guiding idea in 4E cognitive science, particularly in radical embodied cognitive science, which is trying to offer these non-representational, non-computational ways of thinking about the mind. Context matters for everything. So I think I can agree with you that what he's describing here is context when he's thinking about the ecological niche. But he's also thinking about, well, how does context matter for explaining perception and behavior? And that's what leads to these dynamical ideas. So Gibson's thinking was to be developed later on by Michael Turvey and people in the University of Connecticut, who were doing a kind of synthesis of ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory. And this idea of context is one that's really central in dynamical systems theory, thinking about the dynamics, how a system changes over time. It changes in particular ways because of the context. I don't know if that quite captures where your question was coming from, though. Maybe you can try again with it.
Yeah, it helps. I think you provided a lot more context to make that intelligible, but I'll specify it a little bit more just to see if we can get a little bit more juice out of it. Which is like, if you are granting that this notion of concept was something that was a lot of what uh, Gibson was trying to hint at. My question in relationship to metaphysics was in the sense of like, if what we're talking about is context, if it's specificity, if it's finitude of a situation, then that's a very different meaning when we say the collapse of the subject and object there compared to a traditional metaphysical claim of the collapse of the subject and the object. Like that difference is what I'm trying to understand, because you could make the claim, for example, you could try to have this metaphysical framework where you can say, no, actually, there's this distinction, and then you can also, branch off into that, into philosophy of mind and whatnot. So you can have that position, but then you can still grant everything that Gibson said, right? You can just say, yeah, of course, like these distinctions exist, and there's this bifurcation in reality, but nevertheless, when an agent is acting in the world, of course, the relationship is, because it's a relationship precisely, it's this unfolding of these two different things, the agent and the environment, but you're just defining context, right? That doesn't change metaphysics. That was what I was trying to get at.
Okay, yeah, I know, I got you now. Yeah, yeah. So I think it's quite common in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language to have people that say that there's context dependency, and then we can unpack what that is exactly using the notion of indexicality, for instance. So we can continue to think about representations, but there are certain representations that have indexical contents, which means that to cash out what the content of the representation is, we need to specify the context in which the representation is used. So the spatial temporal context, the individual that the representation is indexed to. And so that would be like a way of thinking about context dependency that is perfectly consistent with thinking in terms of representations of representational theory of the mind. And then there are other people that say, well, maybe we need to think of the representations as pragmatic. There's a special class of representations which are for action. They're action-oriented representations. So Michael Wheeler, Andy Clark, Pierre Jacob, Frederic de Vinemont, a lot of philosophers of minds that would endorse the idea that there's a subset of representations which are action oriented, and those representations are about, they have as their content affordances. So you can have a kind of representation, this picture where you still accept that the environment includes affordances. But I think that what Gibson was offering was actually something different from that representation, this picture. And so he was a realist, and he's very insistent on the kind of realism that he has. But and yeah, so when it comes to perception, he fits more with theories of perception that are naive realist theories that think that we have these direct encounters with objects and properties in the world. But Gibson gets himself in a little bit of trouble there, because sometimes he characterizes his realism in a way that makes it hard to see how there could be room for anything in the world that depends on us as social animals and creatures. And in some of his work, he puts forward a realist understanding, which is more relational in the kind of realism that's on offer, which means that instead of thinking of reality as completely mind independent, he instead starts from an understanding of reality that is related to the capacities and skills of animals that inhabit that reality. And it's that second relational understanding of realism that that I would like to argue for, both in epistemology. So, how do we get to know the world? What is how does knowledge work? Well, it works fundamentally through skill, through know-how, through engagement with the world. But also metaphysically, the realism I think we should have is one that is more pragmatic, that's tied to our ways of making inquiry into reality, to intervening on things, to acting. And in Gibson, I think you can find that kind of pragmatic realism as well, when he says things like the organism and environment are a pair. They mutually specify one another. And so that side of Gibson, where we start from organism, environment, mutuality in understanding realism, I think leads to this more relational understanding. So going back to where you started from with affordances, we understand them as relations, and that's a particular metaphysical position, because other people in ecological psychology, like Michael Turvey, have put forward a dispositional understanding of what affordances are, where you can think of the dispositions as something that objects have independently of our perceiving and engaging with them. So the salt will dissolve in water. That's a disposition of the salt, its solubility, that the salt has, independent of whether anyone is using it to um, dissolve in water. That's just a physical property of the salt. For Turvey, affordances were similar. They were these dispositional properties that would be actualized when an agent came along and acted on them. But before that, the dispositions were just something that were properties of the object. Again, that's getting a bit metaphysical, but the reason I went there is because I want to say, well, that contextual idea, we can resist the kind of move that some analytic philosophers might make of context is just indexicality, by offering this relational understanding of mind and world, where they are mutually specifying, co-determining. And that goes back to the phenomenological picture that I started from at the beginning of our conversation.
I see. Yeah, that was very, very helpful, actually, especially when you mentioned the whole problem of realism as well. Now I can bridge a lot better between this notion of context and metaphysics. I think those are really, really good points. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is that, throughout this conversation, we spoke a lot about phenomenology, and also phenomenology in relationships to representations, and obviously that has a very rich history in cognitive science. And on this like attack on representations, both in the phenomenological tradition and in cognitive science, there's also this very deep notion of computation as well, and the mind has basically computation, and there's a whole set of arguments and evidence on why that's not where it's either limited or just flat out wrong, depending on the context that you're applying. But if I understood correctly, you do use, or at least you do try to frame some aspects of the minds within some computational models. And so to me, I mean, this is probably out of ignorance, but to me that is a little bit outside of what I typically think of when I think of a phenomenological approach or an activist approach. So maybe explain that a little bit. Like what kind of computation are you talking about? What does that mean to have a computational modeling of something? And then how do you how do you think about this interaction between these kinds of approaches for ecog sci and the whole phenomenological tradition?
One of the defining moves that are made by post-cognitivists psychologists is to challenge the idea that the mind is a computer. And that's absolutely right. I do want to reject the idea that the mind or the brain is literally doing computation, because I don't think that living beings are machines. So I don't think that they process information. I think that that is a description that we can give of what the mind and the brain are doing, but and it can be an explanatorily useful way of helping us to design experiments and to make sense of what's happening in the brain. But it's not true that the brain is literally a computer or an information processor, unless we think of information along the lines that Gibson mapped out with his idea of ecological information. But even there, I have some hesitation in thinking of information as something that simply exists independently of us and the environment. So in work with Ludger van Dijk, I've argued that information is something that is formed in our use of certain patterns that we can find in the environment. But anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. Going back to what we can do with computational models, I have been working a lot since Andy Clark published his Behavioral Brain Sciences Target article, Whatever Next, with ideas from predictive processing. And Andy Clark has been one of the great guiding figures for me in the work I've done in philosophy of cognitive science. Now, I don't agree with him about everything, but I find his work very inspiring. I love his way of writing, and his work on the predictive brain and predictive processing have been an enormous influence on the work that I've been doing for a while now. And so how would I think about computational modeling? I tend to think that it gives us a level of description or analysis that we can use to formally describe what goes on in biological systems. And that formal level of analysis, level of description, I think is very important for helping us to bridge between neurobiology and phenomenology. So we can use this mathematical level of analysis that we get from computational modeling to do some of that bridging work. But I think we should stop short of saying that because we can build computational models that help us to bridge between levels of explanation, that what is being modeled is the mind, and the mind is literally a computer because we can build models of it. We don't say that when we model weather, there's weather happening inside of the model. And I think in the same way, we shouldn't say that when we model the brain or the mind, then the model has the properties of the system that we are modeling. We should make a distinction between our formal model, which gives us a mathematical representation, and the system that we are modeling, the target system. And we should be careful not to conflate those two. And I think that that conflation is often made in the predictive processing literature, where we say the brain is Bayesian, it's doing Bayesian inference, or it's approximating Bayesian inference by minimizing prediction error. And if we say that the brain is literally doing these things that we use our models to model, then I think we're making that mistake that we make with the weather if we start to say there's literally rain happening inside of our simulation of a weather system. No, there's not. It's a simulation. Similarly for Bayesian models or predictive processing models, we shouldn't say that the brain is literally doing predictive processing, but we can model it as if it were, and that can be a useful thing to do because it can help us to do this kind of bridging work. Have I always been as careful as I should be about that distinction? Probably not. So Jelle Brauneberg in his Emperor's, what is it called? Emperor's New Clothes or something paper about Markov blankets has criticized some of the work I've done with Michael Kirchhoff for not keeping these two things separate enough. And I think that's a reasonable critique to make. So going back to the bifurcation of reality critique from Whitehead, we should be careful not to confuse our abstractions, which are our models, like our computational models, for the reality that's being modeled. Because the reality that's being modeled is a concrete reality of experience. It's not this abstract mathematical reality. And we shouldn't conflate those two.
Yeah, wonderful. I'd just like to dive a little bit deeper. So, like, when you say that the mind isn't doing computation, like, help me, uh, help me specify a little bit more. What does that mean? Like, is what you're trying to mean in the sense that the mind as a whole cannot be defined as computation, or that it's not doing computation, or like what exactly is like the bottom level ontology, let's say, of what this means. And one of the examples on why I'm wondering about this is, for example, I can't name, you know, I can't name experiments from the top of my head, although maybe you'll know some. But for example, I remember when I was first learning about cognitive science, I was just reading a very standard cognitive science textbook, and when it was kind of like going over like this cognitivist period, and this period where people thought that the mind was computation. Like, it's not like, even though a lot of things were wrong, it's not like at the same time that they were pulling this out of thin air. Like, there was also a lot of empirical research where you make the assumption that the mind is doing computation. Although, again, this is a slightly different claim than the mind is computation. So, like, maybe unpacking this would be helpful. But you make that assumption, and then you have this empirical evidence, and it turns out that, the way that cognition works matches your expectation, which is part of what was building back then this argument of, oh, the mind is computational. And I think that's also the impression that I got. And again, I'm not very well versed on this, so correct me if I'm wrong. But like, this is also then the developments that eventually seem to that cognitive science seemed to progress to, where there appeared this notion of modularity in the mind. I don't know if this is still accepted or not, actually. But it was a way to make sense of this, where it's kind of like the brain slash mind is actually this very complex thing. And for some functions it works like this, and for some other functions it functions like this other thing, right? It doesn't have to be like this one model, right? So help me understand a little bit of what exactly do you mean with this computational claim, and where does potentially some computational functions, how do they play out in the mind, and how does this interact with this whole idea of models and reality always exceeding the models that you were talking about before?
So the computational theory of mind, it's useful in that if we just start from looking at the brain and the way that cells communicate with each other, synapses that form, and the neurotransmitters, the networks, the systems in the brain, and their influence on behavior, there's a gap. We have to interpret what that brain activity actually tells us about cognition, about emotion, about behavior, and bringing in the idea that there's this information processing level, there's computation taking place that is solving certain problems, that we can then use to map onto what neural networks are doing when they are increasing the strength of the weights between synaptic connections. if we start to think that that can be interpreted using the idea of information processing, that can give us a very helpful way of going from the neurobiological, neurophysiological, neurochemical activity to behavior and cognition and emotion we're interested in explaining. So by introducing that computer level of analysis, that gives us an intermediate level to work from for bridging between what's happening in the brain and behavior and cognition. So I can see why that was a helpful move to make. Now, should we then say that that intermediate level of analysis that we're using is then literally what the brain is doing, because it gives us a good purchase on neural activity and how neural activity gives rise to behavior. So we can start to say, right, well, that's a useful level of analysis to work from, because there's a sort of abstract organization, a causal organization the brain has that is correctly described by this computational level of analysis. So what we've done effectively is move to a more abstract, functional level of organization, where we can say at that level of organization, the brain is doing computation. So it's a kind of higher order causal organization that we're describing using the idea of computation. And my pushback against that is to say that, well, first of all, the idea of computation brings with it representations. So because computation, is normally given an interpretation using the idea of rules and representation. So, and really all that you have is a notion of information, and information is not enough for representation. So maybe we go to a looser understanding of what computation is, where we just stick to information processing of some sort. But then how do we make the translation from information processing as a description of what the brain is doing to cognition, where cognition, let me just try to finish this train of thought. Where am I going with this? Well, the main thing I want to say actually is that going back to phenomenology again, when we are using mathematical concepts like information, which is a mathematical concept, or when we're working at that more abstract level of organization and saying you can find causal structures that are computational, that is a way of modeling, that is a simplification and idealization of the biological processes. So what makes the computational level an abstract level of organization is that it abstracts away from certain biological details. So if you look at the original work of David Marr on vision, where he would talk about the early visual cortex as computing Laplacian Gaussian function, the activation of neurons that are required to describe the neural firings as the computing of that function is a kind of abstract, idealized description that leaves out some of the details of what actually happens when neurons fire. So the computational level of analysis is an idealization, it's an abstraction. And that's the point I made earlier when I referred back to Whitehead, that we shouldn't make the mistake of taking that abstraction and idealization to be what's really happening, because it leaves out all kinds of biological details that are important. And those biological details relate to being a living being that has a concern for its own continued existence. So when we leave out metabolism and these sorts of processes as not relevant to the computational level of analysis, there's an abstraction that's being made there that I think is actually in the end taking us away from what minds fundamentally are, which is living beings that have a concern for their own continued existence.
Yeah, wonderful. That was really well put. That helps a lot. Since you spoke about information again, uh, that a bit earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned this argument that you've made about that, that if I understood correctly, that information, the concept itself, to be intelligible, it already needs to specify a purpose of some kind. So maybe I'm misconstruing a little bit of what you said, but I'd love to explore that a little bit.
So Gregory Bateson, the cyberneticist, defined information as a difference that makes a difference. And so that's a kind of obscure thing that he put forward there as a way of thinking about information. But I think it's very revealing in that what it points to is that there can be no information without a system that can make use of that information, where the information makes a difference to the behavior of that system. Susan Oyama, a philosopher of biology, writing about evolutionary biology, makes the argument that information has to have an ontogeny to it, has to have a history to it. She puts forward a developmental systems perspective on life, where something only gets to be information for a system because of the history that that system has of engaging with its environment. So there's no information without that information making a difference to action, to what how a system behaves, what it does. And information gets to make that difference in the end because of the history of the organism and its developmental history. So do genes carry information about traits? Well, she would argue not independent of a developmental history. So the genes don't code for traits. They don't have information somehow encoded in the genes about how to build an organism or how to build a particular trait of an organism. The gene only encodes that information in the context, again, of a developmental history.
That makes sense to me. But then, how would you try to apply that framework when information is conceptualized in physics?
Interesting question. So I was thinking about the biological example there, but information is also a quantity that is appealed to in physics. But there, I think, again, it's a mathematical uh, notion that's being employed. So we talk about particles that are affecting each other as communicating with each other. So the Alice and Bob sort of example, where there's action at a distance, and the notion of information is appealed to understand how there could be action at a distance, how these remote particles could be affecting each other in terms of the spin of the particle, let's say. So the notion of information is being appealed to there, but again, I go back to what I said about the neurons computing a Gaussian function. It's an idealization or abstraction. It's a mathematical notion. And we should be careful not to then take that mathematical notion to be something that has concrete reality. Because if we kind of make that mix up of inferring from something that's abstract and mathematical to something that is concretely real, then we're doing what Whitehead called this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We're taking something that is abstract and then confusing it for something that's concretely real.
I see. Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, a lot of the themes in this conversation have been kind of like the bare bones of cognition of what it means for something to be alive, for what it means to be an agent, what it means to act in the world. Um, and obviously, when we talked about Gibson and whatnot, that's a lot of what this is about. It's kind of like this very basic embodiment, animality to our experience. But then, as you said, and as you argued in the paper that I referenced when we were discussing that part, obviously this applies to kind of like higher order actions that we are involved in human beings, has a social element, has a cultural element, whatnot. Now you already touched this briefly, although not a lot. So we could explore that, but and maybe we can. But I also wanted to make sure that not only we make the jump to kind of like this very basic sense of affordances and way of thinking of how agents act in the world, to more complex forms of life that make justice to the human experience. But then I would also like you to explore a little bit of your work of how we can take these concepts but actually apply it to the highest level possible within this kind of like vertical analogy, in the sense of um, existential ways of being in the world, of kind of like the actual well-being of human beings, of the flourishing of human beings. So I know that you have some work kind of exploring these themes, and so maybe like going up a level, I think would be very interesting and helpful, and I would love to hear more about it, of the type of work that you've been doing.
Computational ideas are actually helpful here, and that's in predictive processing. There's this idea of optimality, um, that an optimal agent will be a surprise free energy minimizing agent. And in the inactive literature, there's also a kind of normativity that is talked about when we think about sense making, that that sense making is the source of values and normativity. In the inactive literature, you see that in the most simple, primitive forms of life, like the bacteria. It's already doing sense making when it relates differentially to the sucrose solution and to the acid, and that there's already some value that the environment has for the organism. Um, but the notion of normativity there is, of course, very different from what we think about when we think about being satisfied with how our life is going, or um, being well, or being happy, being fulfilled and flourishing and fulfilling our potential. So again, it looks like there's a gap there, um, between the normativity that you get from biology, that is to do with things like being a good self-maintaining system that can maintain its organization when it's perturbed by the environment. Um, and the kind of optimality that's involved in living a good life and being well as a human being and flourishing as a society or a community. Um, so can we like get any purchase on those thicker, richer notions of goodness that we think about when we think about being well and flourishing and um, fulfilling our potential as human beings? So I have tried to address that gap as well, along with the other gaps that we've been talking about in our discussion. Um, and I think that a way to make progress with that gap is to think about, well, what goes wrong, and can we learn any lessons from what goes wrong in cases like depression, addiction, obsessive compulsive disorder, thinking about the kind of behaviors that people find themselves trapped in, the kind of rigidity that enters into the agent environment system in those kinds of cases. And then, you know, if what is the difference between being disordered in terms of your mind that you see in these kinds of psychopathologies, and being well can we think of these as a kind of dimension where on the one side you've got cases of positive flourishing, and on the other side you've got these kinds of psychopathologies. And practices like psychedelics and meditation are, I think, very helpful for thinking about what we might find on the flourishing side of that dimension, and how actually these practices can take you from one side to the other. So they can take you from being from experiencing an enormous amount of suffering and distress like we see in psychopathologies, to being well again and flourishing. And so we know that meditation can help here. We know that psychedelics can be enormously helpful in a therapeutic context for helping people to recover, to undergo a kind of change where they are transformed through having this kind of experience, and through the journey that it takes them on, that they can find insights into themselves and their who they are and how they relate to the universe, that they can then take with them to grow from, and that can help them to recover from serious mental illness in many cases. Um, so what happens there exactly? And I think that one of the interesting things that we learn from studying psychedelics and meditation is that the unselfing experience is incredibly important. So that's a kind of experience where you transcend your narrow interests and concerns in a way that allows you to connect to something that's larger than you, to have experiences of awe and wonder and curiosity. And these are the sorts of experiences that I think people can be nourished by and grow from in a way that can help them uh, to fulfill their potential as human beings. So there's something there about the connectedness with the with their ecologies, with other life forms, so that, when you have a psychedelic experience, but also from meditation, you can have this experience of like connecting with something larger than you. Um, and I think that is something we can understand neurobiologically as well. And so that gives us a window that may be helpful for understanding better what it is to be well and flourish in the world.
That was wonderful. I would love to explore that further, but I do want to uh, kind of wrap this up a little bit because it has been quite long, and I don't want to steal too much of your time. So there's still a few other questions that I wanted to get into to learn a little bit more about how you think of it. So, in what you just described, you were talking about, how does all of this, very philosophically dense, very scientifically dense, can actually apply to everyday life and to actually things that people actually perceive as being of ultimate significance in their life, even if they don't care anything about, philosophy, supposedly, at least that's what they claim, or science, and whatnot. And then also, when you were kind of explaining a little bit of that vision, you also explained some practices like meditation, for example. So something that I wanted to ask is, not academically, but in your own personal life, like how do you make this bridge between all this heavy philosophy, all this heavy science and cognitive science? Like, how does that show up in your everyday life and in how you conduct yourself?
Well, for a long time, I think it showed up in my life as my being stuck inside of my head, and with my own thinking and my own fascinations with philosophical problems and trying to figure them out. And which led me to be stuck in my study with my books, my writing, and yeah, missing out on a lot of being engaged with the world and with other people and with my family, and came to realize, just for somebody that's interested in embodiment, how much of my life was spent in my head with my own thinking, cut off from everyone else and actually cut off from my body. Because moving around, like I spend most of my time sat down in my chair on my laptop, and so even moving around and being in my body as in movement was something that I didn't do. Um, so, and how could somebody so interested in embodiment be so much in their head? Um, so I got to realize that, actually, and as a younger man, I found yoga and tai chi and qigong and meditation to be really helpful practices for me. But I lost that as I went to do my PhD, and then I got an academic job and all of the demands that academia makes on you. So I kind of lost contact with my embodiment in the world, actually, which is a very strange thing for somebody that works on embodiment, for that to happen to you. It was like this big divide between my ideas that I have about what it is to be human and the life that I led. And then suddenly that realization struck me that there's this huge separation. And of course, it didn't strike me on my own. Things happened in my life that led me to realize that, wow, I'm so separated from my body. Um, and and other people came into my life that helped me to see that. And so I went back to those practices again, actually, and they've been very helpful for me and helping me to deal with personal psychological struggles that we all go through. Uh, yeah, so I do Aikido now, and I love yoga as well, and practice Qigong. Um, and those are things that bring you back into being rooted in your body again. And as a young man, I did psychedelics as well, but then I didn't touch them for many, many years. But recently I've started to dabble a little bit again and find that those experiences also extremely rich, and um, they help you to learn a lot about yourself. So as a young person doing psychedelics, I think that's a very different experience from what happens to me now. And now I know a lot more about myself, and it can be giving me ways to explore myself much more than I did when I used to do it, where it was really about music and being with other people, and being in a kind of joyous experience to share with others. Um, and now it's more of a kind of inner exploration.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I think a lot of people have similar experiences, and I think it's a very um, common path.
Especially in academia. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose in your case, it's a little bit more unusual. I suppose just precisely your intellectual interest was precisely in this notion of embodiment.
Was the
Yeah,
body,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. So that is quite interesting. But I'm glad to hear that you managed to turn that around and that it's having a positive effect. And I'd love to. I had so many questions that we didn't get into just because of limitations of time, and because we also spent so much time dealing with very basic questions before we even got to anything else. Just because, well, number one, they're interesting.
Well, fundamental questions. But you can always have me back another time. You should do that in your podcast, revisit some of the speakers.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's always more to explore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can definitely have another conversation that'd be very very interesting. And I don't mind having repeated yes at all. I've had that in the past. I also plan on inviting Gallagher again because back then I I was starting to get interested in 4E Coxi, but I wasn't as deep into it as I'm now, and I'm still not that deep into it. But hopefully by summer I'll start being a little bit more familiar with all the details. So I plan on having him again.
Takes it's a lifetime thing, right? Like with anything in philosophy, is the deeper you go into it, the more opens up, and that doesn't stop. So yeah,
Exactly.
revisiting things with Sean, you'll be in a different place, and you'll find out all sorts of different things that didn't come up before. But he's one of the great figures in this field, so much to learn from him for sure.
Yes, definitely. So, has a last question, so we wrap it up. I'd like to ask you, like, what do you feel that you are stuck on, like in terms of your academic and intellectual life? What are some problems that you think you just actually don't have an answer for, and you're just trying really hard, but you haven't been successful yet?
Yeah, so I think the question of how to bring philosophy back into life, uh, so how to do this theory practice actually in your own life, and how to not have philosophy just become this thing that is intellectually fascinating and makes you curious, but doesn't actually make a difference to who you are and how you live. So I think that's a big one. No philosophy, because I started as an analytic philosopher. Uh, there, so much of what we do is we think about these puzzling cases and what to say about them, and we have these problems that we work on, and we do it in this very intricate, precise way. Um, but it's intellectually nourishing to do that kind of work, but then it's far removed from the the worlds that we live in, where there's so many problems that we face. There's so many crises that we're living through at the moment: the ecological crisis, the political crisis, and to have philosophy as something that we do that doesn't touch on those crucial things that matter to all of us as human beings, it's um, it's a wasted opportunity. So I think how to bring the philosophical tools into contact with the real, with the moment that we're living through, where there are so many difficult transitions that human beings are going through technologically, ecologically, societally, politically, um, what to do with those crises, how to live through them and be well as human beings. Not to address that, I think it would be um, a failure, actually. So yeah, that's the thing. I think the thing that keeps me awake at night, how to do something politically, actually, as well, and socially and ethically with the things that fascinate me around what it is to be human and to be alive. But to try to bring those questions into contact with things that matter for humanity as a whole, which are all of these crises that we're living through.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. I loved it. And you're super great person to talk with. And you explain things really, really well. So I'm very grateful for you being willing to come on and having this conversation. And thanks for all the knowledge that you shared.
Well, thanks again for having me. It's really been a very rich conversation. I really enjoyed all your questions. So I think we managed to go to some interesting places for the listeners.
Yes, definitely.
It would be nice to meet you in person when you're over in Harlem in June, right?
Yes, I believe in June. So yeah, we'll schedule that, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Great.
All right. Thank you everyone for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode. Cheers.